Hey students, welcome back to our final linguistics lesson here today. Today we're going to talk about how and why language changes and why it matters that language changes. So I want you guys to get out your evidence tracker, and when you see evidence of how or why language changes, maybe an expert's going to talk to you about why language changes, write down the quote and we're going to use that to write this 5-paragraph essay about language and why language is important. And we're doing this all so that we can build a foundational knowledge of how language works and try to understand why we study English every year, all year long in school, because it's a big deal. So I want you guys to work in pairs today, and so with someone close to you, don't get up and move out of your seat because of coronavirus. I want you guys to find someone near to you to work with, and I want you guys really quickly to discuss these questions. How do you think your use of English is different than the way your parents use English or the way your grandparents use English? What kind of words did they say that you wouldn't say? Or even how it's different than your siblings. Maybe you have a sibling who's a lot older or younger than you, or just maybe a different gender or a different personality than you. And I want you to identify what are the things that are different, like what word do you say that your siblings or grandparents wouldn't say. And then I want you to talk about whether you think your grandchildren will speak very much like you, maybe think about how they'll be speaking if they speak differently than you, and identify some words that you have just picked up using in the last 5 years. So right now, pause the video and discuss each of these questions with a partner for just a few minutes. And when you're done, I want you to come here. Today we're going to we're going to listen to this man speak about where language came from. He's going to talk about theories of the very first time people ever started speaking and how that language has changed over 6,000 years. And he's going to talk about maybe where language is going in another 800 years. So we're going to watch this video. You can write down some quotes for your evidence tracker. It would be helpful.
To give you guys $10 worth of language lessons. Italki is a community where you can become fluent in any language by taking lessons with online teachers from around the world. You can find a teacher that suits your budget, schedule, and learning style. The one-on-one lessons are taken on Skype, and afterwards you can practice what you've learned with a community of learners. Just click on the link below to sign up and get your $10 voucher via email. There are estimated to be around 6,500 spoken languages in the world today, but more than half the world's population uses only 20 of them. And the language dies out every 14 days. The most spoken language is Mandarin, with 955 million native speakers, followed by Spanish with 470 million, and then English with 360 million. But how did language originate? And why don't we all speak the same language? Let's find out. Homo sapiens have been on Earth for around 7 million years, and modern humans as we know them today have been around for 200,000 years. The human race is ancient, but we've only been able to communicate with each other via language for a rather short 100,000 years. Scientists believe that humans have always possessed the building blocks for language, but it wasn't until 100,000 years ago when a chance mutation occurred in a single human that put the final building block in place inside the brain, which enables humans to finally be able to talk using legible words. It's thought that the very first words were emulations of noises that would have been heard in nature, such as the noises of animals and the wind blowing through the trees. Scientists theorize that the very first words spoken by humans could very well have sounded like these: bow wow, poo poo, ding dong, yo hee ho, and ta ta. But the truth is we know very little about primitive languages, because writing wasn't developed until much later. And without writing, we have almost no evidence of ancient languages. The first written language we have found evidence for is ancient Egyptian. We have found Egyptian hieroglyphs dating back as far as 2690 BC. But why do we have different languages? Wouldn't it be much simpler if we all just spoke the same language? To understand this, we must first understand how languages developed. Thousands of years ago, isolated civilizations across the globe all had the same problem. They needed a way to describe the things they owned, the tools they used, and the things they did to their fellow citizens. So, they came up with words for all their tools, possessions, and actions. These names would start with one person calling an object by a made-up word, and after affirming to it as that word for some time, other people would begin calling it by the same name, and eventually the word would stick. This enabled them to work together more efficiently and get more done. Today we can get from one side of the planet to the other in just a few hours. But back then, travel took so long that people just didn't bother. This meant that most groups of people were in isolation from the rest of the world. This led to thousands of different groups of people coming up with thousands of different words for various objects. That's why some people may call us an apple, whilst others will call it a pom. Over time, these isolated groups of people met with other isolated groups of people. When this happened, they needed a common way to describe objects, so they both adapted their self-taught languages to create a new language that was a mix of the both. This happened time and time again, and after enough groups of people mixed their languages together, a new super language was created, which was a combination of all the subgroups. This would eventually grow to become one of the many languages we know today, such as English or French. But proximity has a huge effect on how languages develop. Countries next to each other often share similar words. For example, tree in French is arbre, tree in Italian is albero, and tree in Spanish is arbol, whereas countries far away from each other have virtually zero similarities in their languages. This is why the English alphabet looks so different to, say, the Japanese alphabet, because both languages were developed in complete isolation from one another. However, in the modern day where everyone is so well connected, and we can communicate with people on the other side of the world in just seconds, wouldn't it be beneficial if we all just spoke the same language? Many predict that a single global language would significantly increase collaboration and productivity, and some groups have actually pushed for a universal language, but all attempts to do so have so far failed. The problem is that if the world were to adopt a universal language, who would have to give up their native tongue, and who gets to keep it? It's not an easy decision. Language is just too deeply embedded within our culture to just give it up. To do so would be surrendering your country's culture and history. So, for the foreseeable future, languages as we know them today are here to stay. But language does change, and quite rapidly in fact. In the short time we've had the internet, the English language has already changed quite considerably. In March 2011, the Oxford English Dictionary officially recognised lol as a word. But what will the English language look like in 1,000 years from now? Well, Justin B. Wright challenged this question, taking all the effects of different cultures and technology into consideration. He proposed a new language, futurese. Justin took the following sentence. We children beg you, teacher, that you should teach us to speak correctly, because we are ignorant and we speak corruptly. And translated it into futurese, to illustrate what it might look like in 1,000 years' time. He came up with this. When pronounced correctly, it reads, Zog jul wie shong you tizog du jagar redden kutten, woesagen lied lakus bin you gordon and woesag kuro. Quite a mouthful. Sounds like something from a science fiction film, doesn't it? But you can just imagine people speaking something similar to this in the year 3000. And finally, I'll leave you with these facts. There is a language in Botswana that consists of mainly 5 types of clicks. Most languages have over 50,000 words or more, but most speakers only know and use a fraction of them. In fact, in everyday conversation, people only use the same few hundred words. India is home to a menagerie of different languages. 780 different languages are spoken in India. However, 220 of them were lost in the last 50 years. Thanks for the view. Subscribe for more 42.
All right, so I want to talk about some of these ideas that he talks about really fast. He talks about where language came from, and I want to show you guys this picture of this language family tree. And what it's showing us is really it's just focusing on one little branch of languages called the Indo-European languages. You'll notice that there's not like Far Eastern languages like Chinese and Japanese on here because those are different. They have different origins. So we're just focusing right here on the Indo-European origins of language. He talked about how language came from different little tiny small groups of people needing to be able to communicate with each other. And there's a whole bunch of theories about how this started, but basically there's ideas that it started like us imitating animal sounds, which is the bow wow theory, or us imitating environmental sounds, like the sounds of wind or thunder. There's a theory that says we were trying to, we made sounds when we were doing hard manual work, like the yo heave ho theory. And basically these sounds eventually became languages, and probably maybe there's a little bit of truth in all of them depending on what language you're talking about. So little tiny groups of people start creating language based on like animal sounds or nature sounds or work sounds. And eventually, those groups of nomadic people start coming together, encountering each other. And as they encounter each other, they share their words, and their words merge together to form common languages. And for example, the Indo-European language, early Indo-European languages. And eventually, those same groups of people start dividing out again and moving around again. And as they move, we get these little branches of language. So, for example, people in this whole European continent here shares probably some common linguistic features. And then the Western Europeans start to branch out into like Germanic languages and Romance languages and Slavic languages. And these leafy areas represent kind of the size of them, represents how many people speak those languages roughly. So English became one branch of a Germanic language. And the Romance languages, these are French and Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, they became another branch of European languages. And Slavic languages such as Russian and Polish, they became another branch. And the same thing happened towards the Middle East. India and Iran, they developed their own branches of language: Bengali, Hindi, Persian. These are, for the most part, they could tend to be like smaller demographics of people speaking these languages. One thing that I think is interesting is you have the Eastern Europe languages like Russian that evolved closely to the Middle Eastern languages here. So, and then, yeah, so as people separated again, they created separate languages. And then I want to talk to you guys briefly about also the origins of English specifically. And English is a language that originated in the British Isles, what is now called England, but it wouldn't have been called England then. England, like the rest of the world, was probably early populated by small tribal groups, and they were probably Celtic groups. And then other groups started coming in and changing. So those small Celtic groups spoke individual group languages according to their tribe, and they probably had some similarities because they probably interacted and talked to each other. And then other groups started coming in, French and Anglo-Saxons and Normans, and they started adding to their language. So we're going to watch about how this all happened, and then we'll talk about it.
When we talk about English, we often think of it as a single language. But what do the dialects spoken in dozens of countries around the world have in common with each other, or with the writings of Chaucer? And how are any of them related to the strange words in Beowulf? The answer is that, like most languages, English has evolved through generations of speakers, undergoing major changes over time. By undoing these changes, we can trace the language from the present day back to its ancient roots. While modern English shares many similar words with Latin-derived Romance languages, like French and Spanish, most of those words were not originally part of it. Instead, they started coming into the language with the Norman invasion of England in 1066. When the French-speaking Normans conquered England and became its ruling class, they brought their speech with them, adding a massive amount of French and Latin vocabulary to the English language previously spoken there. Today, we call that language Old English. This is the language of Beowulf. It probably doesn't look very familiar, but it might be more recognizable if you know some German. That's because Old English belongs to the Germanic language family, first brought to the British Isles in the 5th and 6th centuries by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Germanic dialects they spoke would become known as Anglo-Saxon. Viking invaders in the 8th to 11th centuries added more borrowings from Old Norse into the mix. It may be hard to see the roots of modern English underneath all the words borrowed from French, Latin, Old Norse, and other languages. But comparative linguistics can help us by focusing on grammatical structure, patterns of sound changes, and certain core vocabulary. For example, after the 6th century, German words starting with P systematically shifted to a PF sound, while their Old English counterparts kept the P unchanged. In another split, words that have SK sounds in Swedish developed an SH sound in English. There are still some English words with SK, like skirt and skull, but they're direct borrowings from Old Norse that came after the SK to SH shift. These examples show us that just as the various Romance languages descended from Latin, English, Swedish, German, and many other languages descended from their own common ancestor, known as Proto-Germanic, spoken around 500 BCE. Because this historical language was never written down, we can only reconstruct it by comparing its descendants, which is possible thanks to the consistency of the changes. We can even use the same process to go back one step further and trace the origins of Proto-Germanic to a language called Proto-Indo-European, spoken about 6,000 years ago on the Pontic steppe in modern-day Ukraine and Russia. This is the reconstructed ancestor of the Indo-European family that includes nearly all languages historically spoken in Europe, as well as large parts of southern and western Asia. And though it requires a bit more work, we can find the same systematic similarities, or correspondences, between related words in different Indo-European branches. Comparing English with Latin, we see that English has T where Latin has D, and F where Latin has P at the start of words. Some of English's more distant relatives include Hindi, Persian, and the Celtic languages it displaced in what is now Britain. Proto-Indo-European itself descended from an even more ancient language, but unfortunately, this is as far back as historical and archaeological evidence will allow us to go. Many mysteries remain just out of reach, such as whether there might be a link between Indo-European and other major language families, and the nature of the languages spoken in Europe prior to its arrival. But the amazing fact remains that nearly 3 billion people around the world, many of whom cannot understand each other, are nevertheless speaking the same words shaped by 6,000 years of history.
Okay, so there's some really cool things that happen here. So we have these Celtic people living in what is the British Isles, and they're speaking different tribal languages, and they're mostly like pagan religions. And meanwhile, the Vikings they've invented sailing, and they're starting to sail around the world, and they're sailing to places like Normandy and Germany and eventually to England. So they go and they go to Germany, and they mix with the Germans, and the Germans and the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, they head over to England, and so England, those Celtic languages start getting really heavily influenced by German, and they start adding German to their language, and they start adding, like some Viking words, Anglo-Saxon words. The word Anglo-Saxon, it evolved. Anglo means English. So this was happening between 450 and 1100 AD. And they also probably used a little bit of Latin because Latin was being spoken in Italy at this time. Latin was kind of an origin language for a lot of languages. And eventually they kind of mush all these German and Anglo-Saxon and Celtic languages together to become what was called Old English. And there's this very important book that's written in Old English, and it's called Beowulf. You've probably maybe watched a movie that's not very similar to the actual Beowulf. And why Beowulf's important is because it's one of the very oldest texts that we have written in what we now consider English. And Beowulf is really interesting because most of the people living in the British Isles at this time were Celtic, they were pagan. And those invaders, the Germans and people from Latin, they wanted them to convert to Christianity. And Beowulf started as a pagan legend, a verbally told legend that they would repeat like a campfire story. They didn't write this story down. And when the Germans and the Europeans started coming over, they wanted to convert the pagans to Christianity. And so they kind of co-opted the story of Beowulf, and they kind of made Beowulf into like a Jesus figure. And so what you see happening in the text Beowulf is a bunch of old Celtic legends being mushed together with Christianity to try to convince the pagans to become Christians. And this text, it's really fascinating. I'm going to play for you Camden's hymn, this little excerpt in Old English, so you can hear what this language sounded like, and it really is going to sound nothing like what you guys probably consider English. I want you to listen and see if you can understand any words in this language.
Nu schulan herjan, heffen riches word, mer to des mechte and his modge thank. Werk wuldur fader, swa he undra gewes. Etche dritten oran steride, he erist shop, jelda barnum, heofen til roffa, helig shippen. Da vid en yard, monkine sward. Etche dritten, efter tjode, Fyrum full am Freya allmäktig.
Yeah, that's Old English. I don't understand any of it. I did catch the word Freya, which is the name of a Viking goddess, so it sounds a lot more Nordic to me than English. And then Middle English. Middle English is a language that happened between 1100 and 1500. And Middle English is a result of the Norman invasion. The Vikings had invaded France, was now France, and they were speaking a lot of French languages, and they were kind of mushing their language and French together, and they brought this language over to England. William the Conqueror did. And language has always been inherently classist. So when the Normans invaded, they started speaking French and imposing French on the Celtic Anglo-Saxons who were already in England. And they used their French as a symbol of their nobility. They wanted to show that they were better. They were the conquerors. They were stronger than the other people. So they started mushing together English and French. So then the Anglo-Saxon languages started picking up a bunch of French language. And I'm going to play you guys what Middle English would have sounded like here.
And I'm going to read the first stanza of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in the original Middle English. Sithen the sage and the assault was saced at Troy, the boar Gritned and Brent to Brondus and Oscus, the tulk that the Tromas of Trajan there wrought was treated for his treachery, the truest on earth. It was Ennius the Arval and his he Akinda, that sithen to praised provinces and patronus become, well nigh of all the whaler in the West Elis. For richer Romulus to Roma, richest him Suiva, with great Babanso that bore Hebius upon first, on Nevenus hit his own Norma, as it knew hot. Tisios to Tuscan, and tell this beginners, Longabaird in Lombardy, and liftus upon us, and fair over the French flowed, Felix Brutus, on Monibunca's full broad, Bretagne Hesetus, with wind, where and rock and wonder be seeth us wont therein, and oft both bliss and blunder, full scape has skifted sin.
So that's Middle English, and I feel like I'm understanding a little bit more of it. I catch words like tree and treason. It definitely has some very Celtic sounds. In Middle English, there's a very famous text called the Canterbury Tales, and in Middle English, there weren't rules for how English should be. There weren't rules for spelling and grammar. They were still just mixing a whole bunch of languages together. So at this time, there were just like 12 different spellings for any word, and anybody could spell any word any way they wanted to and just hope that other people understood. And then we have early modern English, and early modern English happened from 1500 to 1800. This was the Renaissance, so people were starting to become like educated and some really interesting things happened during early modern English period. First of all, Shakespeare. Shakespeare was probably born in about 1590, and he 1564. And he changed language drastically, more than any other individual has ever changed the English language. He created 2,000 new words on his own, not to mention countless phrases. And another thing that happened was the Gutenberg printing press was invented. Before the printing press was invented, all books had to be copied by hand by monks that lived in monasteries. And so only very rich people could afford to buy them. But more importantly, it was illegal for any book to be written in a language besides Latin. And so the only people that could read were priests. And so when the printing press came along, this also happened at the same time as the Protestant Reformation. And so basically there was this push to get learning and education and reading to common people, to poor and middle class people, people who weren't the Pope or the King. And for the first time, books were kind of affordable to common people. And so all of these things changed language a lot. Now, language is inherently classist. We remember from like when the French invaded England and they wanted to be superior to the English people. It still is inherently classist. I'm going to show you guys what early modern English sounded. This is some Shakespeare. You guys hear Shakespeare and you think that it sounds so impossible to understand, but really it's, as far as like a linguistic evolution, very similar to modern English, contemporary English. So I'm going to play this for you guys. Just when you thought Shakespeare couldn't get any better, this handsome man is going to read Hamlet to us in an English accent.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against essay troubles, and by opposing, end them. To die, to slay, no more, and by a slay to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. To die, to slip perchance to dream, aye, there's the road. For in that slip of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life, for who would bear the whips and scorns of time?
All right, that's early modern English. I feel like I can understand almost all of that. Could be because I already know it, but I think if you guys could probably understand it too if you slowed it down and listened. And you can kind of hear the evolution between this very old English to Middle English to early modern English and now to contemporary English. Another thing that happened at this time when the Gutenberg press was being invented and Shakespeare was changing language is shortly after that we have the standardization of the English language. And this is another way that language is going to become inherently classist. People are going to start making rules about grammar and spelling and how language should behave. And this is inherently just a really stupid idea because language isn't something that you can like tame with rules and say you have to act this way and you can't do this, you can't do this. We do it and we try to do it, but we can't stop language from changing because there are like teenagers like you guys who think that it's cool to say the word dope instead of the word cool, and you change language and we can't control you guys. You're out of control. And it's kind of silly that they tried to standardize English. I mean, I guess we can be glad they did because now there's not 47 different ways to spell every word anymore, and it had some benefits. So like the first grammar book was published in 1586, the first dictionary in 1604, and most of the publishing houses at this time existed in London, England, because this is where they can afford printing presses. So that English that was being spoken in London at the time became the right way to speak. And really, there just isn't a right way to speak. We still do this today. We say people who speak like Spanglish or Black American English, or people who speak redneck English are all uneducated English speakers, but really they're really linguistically sophisticated. They're doing their own cultural and regional things with language. Yeah, everything that I'm going to teach you guys about language this year, I feel kind of silly sometimes and guilty teaching you guys, because I don't want you to buy into this myth that we can make language behave, or that language is inherently a reflection of someone's education or value or their cultural worth, because that's just bull. It's just not true. I'm teaching you guys these things so that you can communicate professionally with your boss someday. But if you have a native language or a first language, I think that you should hold on to that with everything you've got, because it's part of who you are and it's part of your culture. And like we learned in this first video, a language is disappearing from this earth every 14 days to never come back. And we know from our first lessons that the way we use language changes the way we think, and we value all ways of thinking. We can learn from all ways of thinking. So, you know, whether you're speaking redneck Utah English or British English or Spanish or Chinese, it is inherently valuable. And I don't want you to buy into these myths of the standardization of English language, even when I'm sitting up here talking to you guys about grammar rules. Just take it with a grain of salt, I guess. Okay, so I'm going to turn you guys loose to finish up this lesson. I've got some activities for you guys. First of all, I want you and your partner to reflect on these questions and discuss them for a minute and take some notes on your evidence tracker. I want you guys to talk about why you think we use different words for words that we already have meanings for a few decades ago. For example, like teenagers invent words to try to be cool, to set them apart from different social groups. That's inherently what's been happening with language all along. You guys are like the Normans trying to be better than the English, the French people trying to distinguish yourselves from the English when you invent words like dope, or I'm trying to think, what was Tate's, what's poppin'? Yeah, you guys are trying to be cool, just like Shakespeare and just like the Normans. And why might people groups create new words when existing words already mean the same thing? I think you know the answer to that. And how do we determine what words carry certain meaning? Who decides what means what? How did we decide that what's popping means how's it going or what's going on? We talked about, like, yeah, I think we talked about how nowadays we say, gosh, what do we say? That's dope, or that's lit, or dope, lit. I can't talk like you guys. I can't think what else there is. Dope, lit. Those are words that we use when we really just mean that something's cool or that we like something. So it's a more modern, contemporary way of saying cool, but really cool doesn't mean what we say it means either. Cool means it's neat, we approve, we appreciate it. But it sounds really silly to say, that's neato, I like it. So instead we say it's cool. It doesn't mean that something's actually cool. It means we like it. And then cool apparently isn't cool enough, so we started saying it's dope. This is how language changes, and it's still changing. In Canvas, there's this activity that I want you to do with a partner. It's called Groovy Language. I want you to watch this video about the Brady Bunch. It's in the Canvas assignment. And you're going to listen to a bunch of things that the Brady Bunch would have said. So this would have been like your grandparents' generation, maybe a little bit younger than your grandparents, and the way they were talking. And when you hear them say something like cool cat or something, I want you to figure out what would be a substitute phrase that you would actually use today. And I want you and your partner to figure that out and write those down in the Google document that's there. And then as the closing activity for today, I want you guys to go into Canvas and answer this question. I want you to write one paragraph of 5 to 7 sentences explaining how and why you think language changes. If you're capable of using some evidence from your evidence tracker, that would be great. So hopefully you can get some evidence from your evidence tracker from this video, or from, what else have we got up here? This video, or this discussion, or these videos, whatever you can get that shows how and why language changes. Hopefully you've got it written down because it will help you answer these questions. If you have any questions today while I'm gone, please feel free to email me. I can't wait to see you guys again, and I hope you're doing well. Have a great day.